Welcome to the end of our discussion on the Industrial Revolution. We've looked at the causes of the Industrial Revolution. We looked at why it occurred in Europe, why particularly it occurred in Great Britain. We've talked about the changes that it made to society. We've talked about different theories of government that have resulted. We've talked about reforms. We talked about how Russia reacted to the Industrial Revolution. And now we're going to look at very quickly how the Russian Oh my goodness, how the Industrial Revolution impacted Latin America. So after the independence movement within Latin America, and we're really looking at all of them, you have decimated populations, both from the wars that were created as a result of independence movement. You have flooded or closed silver mines because that happened because they kicked out the Peninsulares, who were often the ones operating the silver mines. You have diminished herds of livestock, abandoned farms, bankrupt treasury, shrinking international trade, just general devastation from wars, and a lot of political instability. So there's a lot of things that happen as a result of these series of wars and battles and movements for independence in the various Latin American, including Mexico, colonies. And then they've got and once this happens, then there has to be a period of rebuilding and figuring out where to start. And we mentioned that when they had these revolutions, that ultimately in the society very little changed, that the Creoles were just working so that the Creoles could continue to be on top, and not necessarily so that they had the ability so that they could share with other people. That wasn't really a goal. So the second half of the 1800s, many countries in Latin America worked to become more stable. They worked to create functional governments. They worked to get better control over their industry. They worked to try to integrate into the worldwide economy that was really driven by the Industrial Revolution happening not only in the United States, but also in Western Europe. Now, there's a rapid growth of the amount of exports, of Latin American exports to these industrializing nations, because in order for these nations to make the products that they were making in the factories, they needed raw materials, sort of the original purpose that a mother country had colonies. They need the raw materials because in the US or in Europe, they've either exhausted all the raw materials or they never had them to begin with in the amounts that were needed for the amount that they're producing. And so they needed food products oftentimes because they spent less time doing agriculture and needed to import food. They needed raw materials, and then they also wanted more places with which to sell their goods. And we're going to talk about these things later on, and it'll come up again when we talk about the purpose of industrialization. I am going to put this in pause for 1 minute. Okay, so we'll talk about that later on. So now we're just going to look at, there's a chart, already did the chart for you, that lists the Latin American country, and then what exports were, what were they sending out, what raw materials were they sending out. And you'll notice, oh my goodness, that a lot of these are very similar to what they were already sending out before the independence movement. Sugar coming out of Cuba. I love guano, which is bird droppings, which are used for fertilization, is coming out of Peru, just because I think that's interesting. Rubber coming out of the Amazon rainforest, because rubber comes from trees. So all these things that are there that often they were already exporting are now being exported, but they're not part of the mercantilist system. They're part of the fair trade system. So in exchange for these goods, Latin American countries received textiles, which is finished cloth. They got machinery, they had tools, they got weapons, they got luxury goods from Europe and the US. So they had things that they needed in order to develop their country, and that's what they're getting in exchange for. That's the trade pattern. You give me this, I'll give you that. That's set up. European countries also began, and the United States began investing a lot of money in Latin American countries to create internal improvements. A lot of it was focused on communication and transportation within that area, not because the European countries and the United States are awesome people, but because the businessmen that are kind of driving this movement want to be able to get those raw materials faster. And in order for that to happen, they need communication and transportation improvements to be made in these Latin American countries. And a lot of this is based around railroads. They want to build as many railroads as possible so goods can get shipped from one area of the country to another to where they're then exported off. So railroads, big thing. So are they becoming more like Europe? The economies are growing and producing more. The population is growing because the overall health and the ability of food is changing. There are more public health safety measures such as safe drinking water, sewage, vaccinations, etc. And they also begin to have rapid urbanization for the very same reasons that we discussed why urbanization began happening in the United States and Western Europe. There's more opportunities, there's more to do, there's more movement to go to the cities, and the same mechanization that you see in farming is also beginning to happen in Latin America as they're getting those products and those technologies that were already available in Western Europe and the United States. To become more like Europe, the Latin American countries actually wanted more Europeans, whereas before the idea of a European, a peninsulare, was really undesirable. They want more Europeans, not to rule, not to be in a position of power, but simply to be there. And so they began sort of targeting Europeans and saying, come immigrate here. Things suck where you're at, come here. You're going to have more opportunity here. You can have a chance to get in on the ground floor and build yourself up. And they promised them a really prosperous life within the new world. The truth of the matter is most of those promises went unfulfilled. It didn't necessarily, everyone didn't that immigrated into Latin American countries didn't go from a rags to riches. That's not really what happened. The upper class, the landowners that had always existed, are about 1% of the population, and they gained as exports continued, and it made the land very valuable, because if you have a lot of bananas and what you're exporting is bananas, the land that those bananas grow on is super valuable. And so the wealthy continued to be wealthy and continue to benefit highly from Latin America participating in trade and this industrial revolution with the U.S. and Europe. The people that are in the middle class that lived in the cities, about 8% of the population, that number continued to grow, and they also saw an increase in prosperity, just like we saw in Great Britain. And we talked about how the middle class grew, they became wealthy, they were trying to integrate into the aristocracy. You see a similar thing here happening in Latin America. These are your professionals, your lawyers, your merchants, your business owners, and they were learning skills that were very valuable in the modernized society. So they're also prospering. Everybody else, so the other, that's total of 9, with the other 91% of the population is the lower class. And you know what? They stay poor. They live in impoverished areas. In the rural areas, if you are still on the farm, if you're participating in the banana export or the coffee export, and you're the one doing all the work in the field, just like we saw in the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the United States, the workers are completely exploited. You also begin to have a new segment of lower class, the urban workers. They're working in the mines in dreadful conditions in the silver mines in Mexico. They're working in ports, the railroads. There are a few factories, but it's now the urban working poor. So they're not tied to the land and they're not farming and they're poor, but you have an increase in the urban working poor. Similar again to the situation that you see in Great Britain and in the United States. Latin American urban workers began creating mutual aid society. They tried to organize unions. They tried to do strikes, which is where you say, I'm not going to work because your rights aren't being met. And the idea is if we aren't working, then the business owner is losing money. And they realized that a group of people together demanding change are much more effective than a single person asking for change. The same thing that you saw in Great Britain and the United States that we've already discussed. But a lot of the Latin American governments that were created, if you remember when we talked about at the end of these Latin American revolutions, a lot of them ended up creating dictatorships disguised as democracy. We say we're this, but you're really a dictatorship. And they reacted the same way that Russia reacted. They put these things down harsh and quickly. They do not want unions. They do not want strikes. They're not there because that's going to, what they feel is interfere with the stability of the nation. They wanted progress at the extent of, or at the expense of, everyone knowing their role. So again, There's not really an industrial revolution in Latin America. They experience the fringes of it. We're not having massive factories built. We talked about the successes because they're on the fringes of it, of US and Great Britain. Why not? 90% of their population is an impoverished lower class. There's a very small market for manufactured goods. You can manufacture all the goods you want to in Latin America. They can't afford to buy them. It's better off supplying the raw materials to the countries that are making manufactured goods. You have very powerful economic groups that benefit from exporting agricultural products. There's not incentive to invest in manufacturing. We're making too much money exporting these agricultural products and these raw materials. I don't need to invest in that. Political leaders embrace the idea of free trade. That meant no taxes on foreign products. They don't want to compete. They just don't want to compete with the outside foreign products coming in, so they don't create any of their own. Well, let's talk about the economic growth that does happen in Latin America. Latin America's economic growth is financed by capital or money from abroad. They become dependent on Europe and North America becoming prosperous in their decisions. The U.S. companies take advantage of and British companies take advantage of the Latin Americans, really welcoming them in, and Americans go in and they set up companies that they own within Latin America. So much so that they end up dominating the economies of these Latin American countries. For example, the Chiquita Banana Company, that's a U.S. fruit company, or United Fruit Company, that's owned in Guatemala that does the bananas. They go in there, and these American companies go into Latin American countries. They set up companies that are providing these raw materials, and they dominate it. It's a form of colonialism. We'll talk about economic imperialism because that's really what it is. They are dominating what's going on. It's when you have a foreign company that comes into your area and sets up business, and they're the ones that find themselves economically in charge. And that's where we end. It's been 81 slides. You held on for 81 slides in what feels like a bajillion days. You should be ready for your test. You need to make sure that you're prepping, that you are reading. If you've not already started studying for your test, you really need to. There's a lot of information on this 21 and 22 test.